Curtis Knight. I'm the Executive Director here at California Trout. We appreciate you coming here tonight. This is one of our Golden Trout Circle events, which is a space where some of our most important, largest supporters of our organization can come to engage, be informed about water issues here in California. So thanks to you all for being here. And as you all know, the topic for tonight is variability and vulnerability of California's water, adapting to change through pragmatism and partnerships. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. In the variability side of things, we all know California, Mediterranean climate, extremes, it's how we live. We can just look back recently to the drought from 2012 to 2016, followed by extreme wet in 2016, 2017. It's a variable place. Most of us here know that, and climate change is going to make it even more variable, and that variability can often lead to vulnerability. And for example, for us, we worked with UC Davis on a State of the Salmons report a few years ago that showed within the next 50 years we could lose half of our trout, steelhead, and salmon, and that climate change was the primary threat driving that. So that sort of sets the stage for us asking this primary question tonight is how do we adapt? How do we, this changing world, this increased variability, how do we adapt and make our water systems resilient so that they can work and be there for those that need it? And who needs it? Everybody does. Fish, people, birds, the whole thing. So it's a really, really important topic. And a couple of the themes that you'll hear us talk through when we talk about how we're going to adapt to this, lead with science. We need that type of information to help guide our advocacy, help decide what restoration projects to implement. We have to lead with the science. We have to work with diverse interests. If we're going to do anything, we've got to work with diverse interests. So we're excited to talk about that tonight. And implement practical approaches and try to solve the problem. So that's kind of those are some of the things that are going to come up tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to get these people talking, which is going to be great. It's a fabulous group. I'm going to moderate Jeff, and Jeff's going to moderate everybody else. That's probably how it's going to go.
That's a good idea.
You have a harder time there.
But yeah.
Guilty, huh?
And then the other thing that we're going to do, though, is really leave plenty of time for you all. This is an engagement thing, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions to the panel. So with that, let's jump in with introductions. So we're gonna give a little bit of a full background on each speaker. Let's start with Dr. Jeff Mount, is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute, the Water Policy Center here. That's who's hosting us. So thank you, Alan, who directs the Water Policy Center.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful room. Jeff's an emeritus professor at UC Davis in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and he's one of the founding directors of the Watershed Center, where we've had a long history of partnership with the Watershed Center. Jeff was one of the instrumental people, along with Peter Moyle, in getting this CalTrout UC Davis partnership that has really flourished over the years. And we are excited about this. Jeff just got back from last week, his first CalTrout board meeting.
Yes,
So he's now on our board. That doesn't mean what he says tonight has anything to do with us.
That's why I brought two hats.
Yeah. Are you going to put one on?
I mean, my hair's a mess already. I got a PPIC hat here and a CalTrout hat. I'll raise one in case. But I've got Ellen here, so.
That's good. So just a little more on Jeff. He's a geomorphologist who specializes in the study of rivers, streams, and wetlands. His research focuses on integrated water resource management, flood management, and improving aquatic ecosystem health. He's served on many boards and commissions throughout the state, and he's published hundreds of articles.
I don't know about hundreds.
That's more than 100. How's that? Okay.
That's true.
Books and other publications, including the seminal work, that's what it said on the website, California Rivers and Streams, which I agree. That was seminal for me. He has a PhD in earth sciences from the University of California at Santa Cruz.
Go Slugs.
Go Slugs. Go Slugs. Meghan, Meghan Hertel is here. She is the Director of Land and Water Conservation at the Audubon Society. Great partners of ours in the Central Valley, working a lot on our fish and birds and floodplains. There's a feathered fish fins thing in there that I never get right.
So easy to say.
Yeah, it's so easy to say. You might be able to clean that up. She's been there since 2010, and she is responsible for focusing on scaling bird-friendly management practices and habitat restoration on farms and ranches, which I think is a really cool aspect, to benefit target birds and other wildlife. And she has a master's in environmental science from Clark University. So thanks, Meghan, for being here.
I don't know what their mascot is. I feel like
Let's make it a duck.
yes.
Yeah, all right. And then Grant Davis on the end there. Grant, thanks for coming down from Santa Rosa, from Sonoma.
Glad to be here.
Grant is the general manager of Sonoma Water and is responsible for providing drinking water to over 600,000 people in Sonoma and Marin. So that's a big job that Grant has. His team this is also cool, his team are implementing renewable energy portfolio that has resulted in a carbon-free water supply and distribution system. So that is really cool. It's very, very cool. Grant, prior to joining Sonoma Water, was the executive director of the Bay Institute, and he has political science degree from University of California, Berkeley.
Go Bears.
And we have gotten to know, right, it's Berkeley heavy over there. But we've gotten to know Grant and his amazing team at Sonoma Water lately, working on the Potter Valley project, PG&E project, on the Russian and the eel. And it's really cool. We got some really cool stuff we might dig into a little bit today, but there's a lot of stuff happening with the team at Sonoma Water that we're excited about. And then finally, Dr. Ted Grantham is the adjunct professor and assistant cooperative extension specialist at UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. We've had a long history with Ted, going back to his postdoc days with Peter Moyle, doing some cool research on in-stream flows, and he's continued that. And it's really exciting to announce that Ted is the first ever PPIC CalTrout Ecosystem Fellow. So this is here at the Water Policy Center. So this is something that the Water Policy, Jeff and Ellen created, and several of you here in the room have helped fund. So thank you for that. You know who you are. We're excited to have Ted fill that first seat. Ted's research, it focuses on the relationships between hydrological and ecological processes relevant to the management of water resources. An overarching goal is to improve, this is the cool part, improve our ability to predict the effects of climate change and management actions on freshwater ecosystems and the socio-economic and ecological benefits they provide. So that's awesome that's a research focus. So this is great. So let's get to these people because they got a lot to say. Starting with Jeff. So just right to the chase, what are the primary impacts climate change is going to have on California's water?
So I'm going to put this couch this in the terms of a CalTrout hat, and sort of thinking about when Curtis goes to work every day, what he worries about besides managing an organization like CalTrout, and that's looking out in the future. The same for what Meghan worries about as well. Actually, same for all of us. And we could start with the famous Peter Moyle line, it's complicated. But I can simplify this in a way that we did in a recent publication at PPIC. We tried to take a look at climate change and what's happening with climate change and what kind of pressures are coming about. And we boiled it down basically into 5 things that should make Curtis and I wake up every day and worry about how his organization is going to adapt to this or suggest pressures for adapt. Number 1 is temperature. This is the thing of the least uncertainty. It's almost a double negative, I guess. That is the highest certainty that we have at this point is that we are warming, and we are warming in all 4 seasons. So this is not just warming, but where we're really warming a lot is in the winter. It turns out, and this is a trend in California that really flipped in the early '80s. And for those of you who have lived here a long time, you're acutely aware of this. Big changes. So warming. Now, warming produces a whole lot of pressure on the kinds of things that Curtis worries about, not the least of which is water temperature. We're at the southern limit of anadromy, and anadromy is typically associated with sensitivity to water temperatures. So we're warming, and that creates water demand, greater demand for irrigation, a variety of effects that you have to worry about. At the same time, and related to that, we really are, this thing you keep hearing about is that the rain-snow mix is demonstrably changing. Our certainty on that is relatively high, that we're seeing it, and what we're simply seeing is that it is more rain, less snow. That has a lot of impacts associated with this. Cold water management that CalTrout focuses on a lot, the issue of cold water management. Turns out that snow, when it melts and it flows into a reservoir, is cold. And that allows the storage of cold water behind reservoirs so you can regulate cold water downstream. In the years where we have very little snowpack and warmer conditions, we find reduced volume of cold water behind the reservoir. So this is really important. It's extremely important to water management, since snow is about 30% of our storage statewide. So that's a snowpack. And then there's the things you don't think about so often. And that is the thing that the climatologists call seasonality. What we are now seeing is a trend with moderate confidence that we're seeing a trend, and the models that look to the future is increasing seasonality. And what I mean by that is winters are getting shorter. That the fall and the spring is lasting longer, and they are drier, and winter is shorter. So we're packing our precipitation in California into a narrower and narrower window, and relying more and more on a few less and less intense storms. So that we're packing, this seasonality is a major challenge. And if you think about it, when you're up on the Shasta River, for example, doing the restoration work you guys are doing on the Shasta River, it's really important when they start to irrigate. And if your spring is longer, they irrigate sooner. And there's a whole lot of fish, as Ted will be able to tell us, are really dependent on that spring flow. So that seasonality is another challenge for CalTrout. Then there's what Daniel Swain has called climate whiplash, which I think is a good idea. And if you think you have missed whiplash, well then you watch too many soap operas and too much TV because you didn't go outside. Well, we went from the worst drought in the history, when you talk about temperature and dryness, to the wettest year on record. And then we went dry again, and then we had cold and snowy this last year. Oh, everybody forgets it was a great skiing season here, a handful of these. We are in climate whiplash. Now, all climate models are starting to suggest that this is what the future looks like. Lots of really wetter wets and really drier dries. And of course, for the resources you care about, it isn't the wet that you're concerned about, it's the dry. But we're now having to change our management to managing floods for drought and managing droughts for floods, and this is the brave new world. And then finally, the last thing is sea level rise. What's that got to do with trout? Well, it has a tremendous amount to do with not just trout, but of course salmonids in general. And sea level rise in California is catching up to the rest of the world. We lagged behind because our water was colder offshore. So now it's warming up, and thermal expansion of the oceans, we're seeing the effects of sea level rise. And sea level rise plays a major role on how it affects estuaries. And estuaries are critical rearing habitat for anadromous fishes. And this is going to be important. And oh, by the way, there's this one really big estuary in here called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is the black hole of water politics. All light and matter goes into it, and then it comes out. And sea level rise is having a major impact on, and will continue to have a major impact on that. So when Curtis gets up every morning, I'm pretty sure he doesn't say, oh, if only I could deal today with the increase in temperature, the changes in snowpack, this thing called seasonality, longer springs and longer falls, climate whiplash with these seasonal wetter wets and drier dries, and a progressive rise in sea level. But that's it. It sums it up in 5 things. So I'm a firm believer if you can do 5 or less, people might remember that.
I guess 3, but if you
Okay,
want to try
that's
5.
right. Okay, that's right.
It's 3 for me.
Wait a minute, you're a UC Davis graduate. You can do 5. So 5 things. And that is what is the major pressure that we will have to come up, and people like Grant and Meghan have to come up with clever ways to adapt to this.
So you brought us down here.
Sorry, Dr.
Yeah,
Newman.
right. You brought us down, and it's gonna be up to these three to kind of lift us back up and how we get ourselves out of that. But Meghan, we work together a lot. Our groups, fish and birds. There's a lot of overlap there. It's great to have partners like Audubon. So from a bird's perspective, you take all these impacts and all these changes coming up. What are you seeing? What's going on in the bird world?
Well, first I want to give Jeff kudos because Jeff was one of my first introductions to California water. He may not remember this, but roughly 13 years ago, he took me on a whitewater rafting trip. He's just saying that because he doesn't actually remember.
It took about 1,000 students.
But I was brand new to California, and he took me down the Tuolumne River and talked about how water is managed in California, and I was completely hooked at the complexity of it. So thank you for that. All this time, I've
And
just
here
been
you
trying
are.
to get on a panel with you.
There we go.
But to your question about
Yeah.
how do we adapt, so you talked a little bit about how closely climate change and water are linked, and so I want to spend a moment talking about climate change. How many people in here regularly read the New York Times? Online's fine. Great. So in the past month, you've probably seen a couple of major studies that have been released about birds and climate change. So about a month ago, Cornell released a study that showed just in 50 years we have lost 3 billion birds. So that's within our lifetimes in this room. 3 billion birds, 50 years. It's like the 50% fish gone in 50 years. I mean, these statistics are shocking. I work on these numbers every day, and it still shocked me and my colleagues. And then on top of that, we had the Audubon study that was released just this last week. And thanks to you who have completed a survey providing your input. Corey, appreciate that. But just last week, we released a study where we look forward. And we look at what climate change impacts we expect to see on birds going forward. So we took millions of bird observations in North America over the last 100 years, combined it with climate models, land use change. And what we found is that 2/3 of North American birds are at risk of extinction by 2080. If we hit a 3 degrees Celsius increase. And as Corey and I were talking about, we're rapidly moving past that in many cases. Both of these studies, though, are a call to action. So the Audubon study particularly showed that if we can keep it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 70% of those birds that are at risk of extinction in North America fare far better. And when I think about what we need to do to help birds and to think about climate change, water, especially in California, is at the crux of that. So I live in Sacramento, so a lot of my perspective comes from the Central Valley. But when you think about water in California, you need to think about the Central Valley because so much of our water that serves our major metropolitan areas and the incredible agricultural engine that we've got in California is moving through the Central Valley and moving through the black hole.
Yeah,
Is
the
that
black
what you
hole,
called
yeah,
it?
that's
The black hole. We have an incredibly highly managed system. I read something today that said that you could not have designed a more complicated and contentious water system than what we've got in California. We've dammed all but, one of our rivers. We've levied off all our major rivers. Most of our creeks and streams now are agricultural water delivery systems or drainages. And the consequences are the drop in species that we see in both fish and birds. But the good news about a highly managed system is it's a highly managed system. So we are making choices about where and when water is being used and how it is being used. And you've got innovative agencies that are taking a hard look and thinking about creative ways to make water go further or to have water use less energy when you're delivering it. So those are stories of hope, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Grant. But when I think about the highly managed system that we've got, we have opportunities to work with what would be considered non-traditional partners, fish and birds, maybe, I don't know, or farmers, or water districts, or urban areas, to go out and test things on the ground, see if we can mimic some of the historic ecosystem function that we have lost. Some of it is as simple as spreading out and slowing down water on the landscape to create fish food or to create bird habitat. And we've shown it works. So the Cornell study had one bird group that hasn't declined in the last 50 years, waterfowl. And that is primarily because Ducks Unlimited and groups like Audubon, TNC, Point Blue have worked with farmers throughout the country to protect habitat on private lands and to manage water differently to benefit that bird group. So there are some real lessons learned, and CalTrout is helping lead the way to mimic some of those lessons now for fish, and fish and bird evolve together. So the same practices should work in both cases. I think the challenge for us as we try to adapt is how many multiple benefits can we get out of every acre foot of water and each acre of land? And that's really what we need to think about going forward.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. That's a good setup, and I think it gives a good insight to how conservation group thinking about how to deal with a lot of these changes and that forward thinking, trying new things. That's why we've gravitated to Audubon for sure. And then I think about somebody like Grant, and I think, I worry when I wake up. Megan does too. Grant's got to supply 600,000 people with water. We did a little prep for this, believe it or not, last week, and we got Grant on the phone. Jeff and I did, and he was very gracious with his time in the midst of a power shutoff for his county. There's a lot going on, so thanks for taking that. But Grant, you know, what are some of the things that you all are doing? You see what's coming. Sonoma's a really variable place, a lot going on up there. How do you guys meet some of these challenges with the variability?
Well, thanks for asking, Curtis. I just first out of the gate want to say thank you for supporting this wonderful organization. CalTrout has this unique ability, and I'll focus a lot of my comments on what we're doing together. But it's in general, you really can't make substantive change without partnerships and coordination and looking for multiple benefits, as Meghan was just talking about. Curtis and his team approached us up on the Russian River and caring passionately about that system as well as the Eel River. And so right out of the gate, I acknowledge that we import water, although our importation of that water up off the Eel through the Potter Valley Project system is primarily for the benefit of fish. It's to create the environmental flows that are required and are state mandated. But the innovation that's going to occur over the multiple years ahead of us, we've just begun. It's a long process, but CalTrout has really done a lot of stakeholder interviews and been a motivating force to bring in not just Sonoma Water, but colleagues to the north up in Mendocino County, the tribes, and additional Humboldt County. And it's going to require some really innovative thinking and a commitment to science. So I completely share that. So what do I worry about? Yeah, the power going out, we just went through that last week. That's just indicative of what climate change is going to require, not just water managers, but our community to be able to respond. And it's a bright community, the water managers, the academics. We rely a lot on the modeling, and I'm an advocate now of having the state of California really designate the types of models, whatever the bookends are going to be. Let's pick one so we can begin planning. We have 59 different models that we somehow have to look at and hindcast with, and it's too many. So I think the state could do us all a favor, maybe take me one of this. Pick a few that will manage for, and let us get going, because there's a lot of work to be done. I do worry about what every water year is going to be like, and it's been well said earlier tonight. You know, that drought was a long one. There were really two droughts because there's one that preceded it, but it was followed by the wettest year on record in Northern California. So we have one of the most flood-prone areas of the state. And you add flood, drought, and then add fire on top of that. And we're talking catastrophic fire, which is what we were all trying to prevent last week. And we just have a huge Herculean task ahead of us that's going to require and challenge all of us. So my vantage point on this is to acknowledge that it's going to require people smarter and more dedicated and more committed over a long period of time. CalTrout has a unique perspective of advocacy for anglers and fish. We have 3 listed species in our system, and many on the endangered species list. And my view has evolved over time, and the agencies that are responsible are watching the decline of these wonderful species, are tasking us to do more. And as a result, I believe, and certainly our organization, the carbon-free water came about because we realized we're the largest energy user in Sonoma County. And it led to putting in solar, looking at geothermal, even putting some wind up, and really making a commitment to deliver every molecule carbon-free. And I'm hoping others will follow that. But when it comes to fisheries and water, we've taken it upon ourselves and made a conclusion that I hope others will follow as well, which is water managers are worried about water supply and water security and resilience. And that is something that you have to ask your question, what's the most reliable way to achieve that? And after the years of working on large-scale restoration projects with CalTrout and many others on the Russian River, I'm a firm believer that if you don't just go for the minimum, you don't just try and squeak by on what's legally mandated, because that's never tenable. That is something that takes you into a uncertainty. And if one thing goes wrong, you lose a species. Imagine that. So trying to see what the restoration scenario looks like and what the water supply regime you're going to hear about later requires, and building that into your game plan and working toward that is a far smarter bet. It allows you to evolve on uncertainty and look at climate change and that variability. And if you're able to make those substantive improvements, and we've, for example, the last 10 years restored about 3 miles of dry creek, which is a misnomer. It's actually very wet dry creek. We have 3 more to go as part of a biological opinion. So my message here is the agencies that go ahead and actually implement toward a biological function are going to have more reliable supply and it's a more secure and sustainable way. And I hope that that is something that my colleagues will begin to adopt as they realize that just shooting for the bottom is a very risky proposition, actually, and it's not really getting the job done, not in this day and age in California water. So it's a privilege to be working with CalTrout and colleagues up here. Sonoma water is one of many. We don't know it all. I would say that we're fortunate in the sense that we do not delve into that black hole. We're actually off, they don't exist in that. So the business proposition is that we're smaller. If we screw up, it's not going to take the entire state of California's water supply down. We tend to pilot things that work, and if they work, replicate those. And the things that don't work, you don't hear about. We don't promote those. So that's been our recipe. Thanks for inviting me.
Right. No, that's perfect, Grant. I think it really gives good insight into some of the challenges you have, but also, I mean, kudos to the innovation that you all brought there at Sonoma Water. That's really cool to hear more about that. And similar to Meghan in the conservation side, Jeff sort of set the stage for what are the challenging issues that we're going to have to tackle. Good examples from about some of the ways you might do that. And Ted then we look to somebody like Ted to say, okay, we need some more tools in the box. Ted, Ted has a great job. I think you have a pretty cool job where, it's just I get to think about in-stream flow. Ted is one of the leading experts on in-stream flow, and a lot of these concepts of environmental flow, an environmental water budget, environmental water transactions, Ted is on the pioneering edge of. So talk to us, Ted, about, as we move forward, what are some of the tools that you are working on to help us figure all this stuff out?
Sure, absolutely. First, thank you all for the opportunity to be the first PPIC CalTrout Ecosystem Fellow. It's really exciting. This is not my first collaboration with CalTrout, as Curtis mentioned, as a postdoc at UC Davis, working with Peter on a project looking at environmental water issues in the state and how to identify dams that could be better managed for ecosystem benefits. And we still have some work to do on that.
We do.
And throughout the state. But I think one message I'd like to communicate is that from everything that I've learned looking at these issues around in-stream flow management or sort of securing water for the environment is that there are a lot of solutions out there to balance human and ecosystem needs everywhere from, I do a lot of work in Sonoma County on the tributaries there and wine country, up to some of the larger tributaries in the Central Valley, Poudre Creek and others. We're seeing really innovative solutions that are really meeting both human and ecosystem needs and what Peter Moyle would call reconciling these debates. And so this probably doesn't need to be said, but we really do need to move beyond the paradigm of sort of fish versus farms, because the evidence just doesn't bear out that is a fundamental or irreconcilable conflict. For the past few years, I've been working pretty closely with PPIC on some of their work around thinking about ecosystem water management, and through some other projects, really focusing, I think, on sort of what I see as sort of 3 critical components to making this work. The first is, as Curtis mentioned, is quantifying, securing water for the securing a block of water for the environment. We call this ecosystem water budgets in the PPIC world. So we don't do a very good job of accounting for water that's actually dedicated for environmental benefits. That's just throughout the state we do a reasonable job accounting for water that's going to farms or going to cities. We do a very poor job of actually accounting for water that's need for securing water for the environment. But then once we do that, how do we actually manage it? And this is actually where I've been spending a lot more of my sort of scientific time thinking about, is if you did have water that you could, allocate in a way to improve conditions for fish and other ecosystem attributes, how would you actually do that? And so I've been working on a project with the State Water Board and colleagues at UC Davis to develop what we call a functional flows approach. And this is again, sorry, apologize for the jargon, but the idea here is that we know a lot about the way these river systems work. And if we can allocate water in a way that preserves sort of the essential or fundamental functions of ecosystems, we can actually go a long way in maintaining the species and the health of these systems that we're trying to preserve. And through this approach, we've actually found again that we're not talking about huge impacts to human water needs. It's really about delivering more efficiently, using the water that we have. And so I think we have a lot of opportunities to employ some of these sort of novel approaches where we can really improve the health of ecosystems without having substantial impacts on human needs. And so I've been really, I'm very actually optimistic, despite sitting on this panel with Dr. Doom, about our ability to do this. And not to say it's going to be sort of an easy road ahead, but I feel like there really is a confluence of interest in solving this problem, and in some ways I think about climate change and all the challenges that climate change brings. But as if we look back to sort of the history of California water, it's always disruption that leads us to progress on the policy front and the way that we think about water management in particular, whether that's a big flood or a big drought or some other disruption. And I think climate change, is certainly serving that role. It's certainly a wake-up call, and I think it's sort of opening, it's breaking down sort of these silos that I think have really been an obstacle to advancing these more creative solutions. And hopefully that will be the case looking to the future.
Yeah, that's good.
Can
Yeah,
I
go
build
ahead.
on something? So you heard all three of us talk about ecosystem function and not managing to the baseline, the minimum biological, but recreating some of the function and system that was there historically. And that's a really key point here. So right now, the way that we manage water is for the species that we are losing, right? So we're managing it for endangered species. And a friend of mine and colleague, Louis Baer from Reclamation District 108, will frequently say the Endangered Species Act is like the emergency room, right? It's when you're really, really sick and you need help instantly. What we don't manage right now is the holistic care. And so as we think about this restoring function, that's the holistic care, right? That's the whole, how do we keep the system healthy? We still need to have the emergency room because we're losing species and we need to save them, but we also need to spend some energy and capital on providing that bigger system function. So I think that's something that I recognized in all three.
Let's run that over to the guy who actually manages the system, because Meghan and I are in absolute agreement on this. And Ted too. But we have the luxury of not being in charge,
Right.
And you are, and so when I keep thinking about this, Meg's absolutely right. I mean, it is an emergency room. This is like managing healthcare using emergency rooms. It's the way we currently do this. But what do you have the tools because you're integrated management to do this? And if not, what tools would you need to be able to adaptively manage this? I'm going to call it ecosystem-based management rather than the current single project, single species management that we're doing. What do you need?
Honestly, I don't think we have them yet. I really don't. I think what you're talking
Is that
about.
Russian? Yet?
we need to aspire to that. Folks like Ted can probably help point us in the directions of what types of flows are necessary and under what conditions. I mean, it's the nature of this. I happen to have 8 contractors that I have to serve. So these are retailers, right? So we're wholesaling water that's primarily out of the Russian River, this wonderful watershed, down into Sonoma and Marin County. And they all want to have water that's probably the most affordable possible, I would put it that way. And when we talk about what type of mechanisms you're going to need to allow the headwaters and to steward that resource all the way through, we need new tools. We came up with a watershed surcharge of sorts on the per acre foot that we deliver. It's not huge, but it does manage to, for example, put money into an account that lets us do large-scale restoration. And the types of ecosystem functions that we're talking about that bring restoration as a method of delivering water. That's just one of the mechanisms, and we had huge debates over, the water industry was not looking to get a new tax. And there's just huge consternation over any new fees that are going to be put on, regardless of the noble purpose. So I guess I would just say that if it were easy, we would have done this. We have the best of intentions, but I do want to share one thing because it is a tool, and it's something I'd like the audience to be aware of because it's showing great promise. We manage 2 reservoirs with the Army Corps of Engineers, Lake Sonoma, which is our largest reservoir, and Lake Mendocino. And it was Lake Mendocino where Governor Brown's first drought task force emerged, and the first place they went. And we were managing a mud puddle. This is right back in 2013. And I just never forget that experience. It stuck with me. And we, as a result of that, knowing that you're trying to metering out in the middle of a drought, something that's not going to make it through, we had to do better. So working in a collective fashion, we developed an MOU with Scripps Institute of Oceanography down in San Diego, and the team that's looking at atmospheric rivers. And so one thing I'd like you to, if you aren't already aware of this, when we talk about extremes, that's our extreme weather, is an atmospheric river. And they come in off the west and they slaughter California. Just about all of our flooding can be attributed to a presence of atmospheric rivers. And the reverse is also true, that the lack of atmospheric river presence leads to drought. So those are some of the emerging bits of information that we have to deal with. Well, bottom line is we've been working for over 5 years now on understanding the atmospheric river phenomena and being able to say when these large incidents come in, they're going to just dump volumes of water either above your reservoir or below. It's really important that you know which. And we've got to understand that trajectory and understand the science behind that. And that means a major investment in the science, just as Curtis was talking about. The state has been putting in some information for that, but we have to have a sustained, coordinated investment in the science behind the phenomena of atmospheric rivers. And the reason this is so challenging for those of you that are funding out west is we're 3,000 miles away from the capital in D.C. And what's back there are hurricanes and nor'easters and to a certain degree tornadoes. They do not have to worry about atmospheric rivers. So NOAA and Department of Commerce and the Weather Service have a bias, from my point of view. It's an eastern bias. We've got to do a better job of bringing that forward, and the philanthropic community and the folks that are relying and having to respond to these atmospheric rivers give me hope that if we can get that up off the ground years from now, we'll be able to do a better job managing existing reservoirs for water supply and fisheries benefits. But we've got work to do.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. I think that's a good segue. I just wanted to get, well, let me touch on one more topic before we go out to you all, and you're touching on it too a little bit. But let's talk policy, maybe politics a little bit, but especially policy and maybe state. We could talk about the federal thing a little bit too, but we have a new governor's administration who has a different approach towards water, a little bit different approach. So maybe one for those of you, how does that? What are some of the things? What are some of the opportunities there? Maybe challenges with this new administration at the state level, and then policy-wise. I mean, let's just talk about that a little bit, because I think innovation at a small scale is great, and that's how you set the example. But to really scale that up, you really need policy to memorialize that, where you're having it at a scale that has impact. And that's something that we talk a lot about in the Central Valley, where we're doing these experiments that are growing in size, but how do we scale that out? The Groundwater Management Act of 2014 is a great example of some of that policy that's going to have some big changes. So that's a pretty wide open field. But new governor administration, opportunities, challenges there. Is there anything that pops up to any of you? Dr. Jeff?
I'm going to let Meghan start.
Meghan?
So I'll just jump in with one quick thing, and that is the system of water management that we've got in California is not under California's complete control. So we have two systems. We have a federal system and we have a state system. They meet together in the black hole of the Delta. It will forever be known by that by now. And these two groups have to coordinate. And now you can imagine at this time, the coordination's not going so great. And they're actually undergoing a process right now to try to figure out how the state and federal government can work together to manage the Bay Delta, which is literally the hub of our water system in California. And now this process has been plagued by all kinds of accusations of poor science, hidden science, fast-tracking it to meet with new federal standards. It's to be seen what will come out of this process and how quickly it will land in court. But that's an example of California having great innovations and a governor that wants to prioritize water resilience, and also it's not just up to us. We have to work in this political sphere where policy can often stop some really great ideas from happening because we've got to work through these really complicated issues.
So PPIC has published about this extensively in the past, and we have a suggestion, a policy suggestion for you. The fact that we have a parallel system, and the fact that Ellen is here and smirking at me because this is my high horse. So,
Does that mean she doesn't agree with you here?
No, actually, she's a co-author on what we're
Okay,
doing.
good.
So,
Was she the dissenting voice?
No,
Yeah.
she's my boss. We have proposes. You have to remember that we have a parallel system that Megan's talking about, with the Central Valley Project run by the federal government, the State Water Project run by the state. And which essentially does the same thing. They have parallel facilities, they even share facilities, and they have coordination agreements. And it's under a great deal of stress. I'm not speaking out of turn here or anything. The current administration is making it extremely difficult to
The federal administration.
Current federal administration. The state is sort of trying to do a steady as she goes approach rather than completely tearing their hair out and gnashing their teeth over it. There is a simple solution. It is an accident that we have a federal project here in the first place. And that was, of course, during the Depression, when the original State Water Project was getting started and the state government couldn't afford it. So the federal government took it over to boost the economy of California. Well, you've been successful there. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. It's now time to leave. And so the fact is that none of us were there when the previous head of Interior said to Jerry Brown, "Anytime you want the Central Valley Project back, you can have it." Regrettably,
Does the state not want it?
Oh no, I think we. Oh no, if you ask in the current administration.
So what prevents it from happening?
A memo. I'm serious. It could be. Yeah. I'm telling you, we're that simple.
I was just trying to think about how long that memo would be.
Okay, but they could, for $1, sell it to us. And I think the previous administration, the Obama administration, would probably have been all for it. And early in the Trump administration, they'd have been for it, but the relationship has soured so much now. So that may have to wait. And as I said at the CalTrout board meeting this weekend, remember the Chinese proverb, if you wait by the river long enough, the body of your enemy will float by. So in all water
You're saying that with your CalTrout hat on, right?
you must be patient in water politics. Look at the greatest dam removal so far in North America. It was the Elwha Dam. Everybody agreed it was a great idea 25 years ago. It takes time. You have to be patient.
I will just say on that one thing, so it could be as simple as a memo, but one of the things we suffer from in the water world and in the conservation world, and I think many different silos, is that we're scared to let go of the little piece of whatever it is we have for the great unknown that comes next, whether that's an archaic water rights system or it's an Endangered Species Act that could use some reforms to be more successful.
Change is hard, yeah.
Change is hard, and
Yeah.
that would be a massive change.
I'm all for it.
Yeah. Well, Ted, just talk about, so policy-wise, but
Yeah.
let's talk about a piece of policy specifically, the Groundwater Policy Act 2014. This was a huge deal. We were, I think, the last state, Texas, and we were close with Texas on actually regulating groundwater. And it's taken a while to put this thing into effect, but Ted's been doing a lot of work on this. Just talk about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, who's heard of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SIGMA?
Yeah, oh, that's.
So okay, so many of you have. Okay, so
That's great.
yeah, so this
Yeah.
in the in the depths of the drought in 2014, there was sort of a miraculous coming together of forces, kind of recognizing that. I mean, it sort of again had been known for quite some time that our groundwater use was incredibly unsustainable, but that the levels were dropping rapidly throughout the Central Valley and many other groundwater basins throughout the state, and there was this moment of collaboration in the context of this unfolding disaster of the drought, and they passed an act, a new law that basically required that all groundwater basins needed to be brought into sustainable use within the next 25 years or so. What we're seeing now is this law was passed, and the sort of organic formation of these groundwater sustainability groundwater agencies were formed, and they're now developing their first plans. And from everything that we've seen, they ain't pretty. We still have a long way to go, and the governor's going to need to be really on the ball to ensure that the implementation of this policy stays on track. And I don't know if sort of the public really appreciate the stakes that of whether this succeeds or fails. I mean, there's a conservative estimate by PPIC of the amount of land fallowing to sort of meet these sustainability requirements. It's on the order of maybe 500,000 acres, up to maybe 1 million, some cases, within the Central Valley, right? So this is a huge
That's a big shift in land use,
shift in land use. It's probably going to be worse if they don't implement the Groundwater
Right.
Management Act in a way that actually works. This is obviously going to be hugely disruptive to agricultural communities, to the rural communities in these places, but it has huge implications for fish and wildlife as well, and for the restoration of the San Joaquin and some of these rivers that we're trying to bring back. There was, I guess, sort of where there's maybe some, again, trying to balance with a little bit of optimism.
Yeah.
In here is there's with some of the changes that we're seeing around climate change, there's been, I think, a sort of a growing awareness that groundwater is really going to be the key to adapting our water system to our future climate regime. So not only is groundwater sustainability important for a whole host of reasons for farmers and for the Central Valley, but it is the key strategy that needs to be implemented so that our water system sort of survives climate change. And what I mean by that is well, first of all, we can't build bigger, more reservoirs, despite opinions of some, I guess. Raising dams or building new dams is not the solution. Getting water in the ground is, and so to do so, there's a lot of innovation happening around what they call FloodMAR, managed aquifer recharge, getting water onto floodplains so that it gets into the ground and raises water tables. And Jeff mentioned this whiplash idea that we get these, this kind of flipping back and forth between these extreme wet and dry years. So when we do have these wet years, developing strategies that gets water into the ground is really going to be key to adapting to climate change. And what's exciting in my mind about that is the potential for ecosystem co-benefits, right? We've seen how getting water on floodplains can bring back birds, can bring back fish. Can we actually do this in a way that meets all of these benefits? So that's where I think a lot of the scientific community is really focusing in partnership with water agencies and with conservation organizations and with farmers. And I think we still have ways to go in there.
Yeah.
There are certainly a lot of practical implementation challenges, but I think we do see a pathway forward.
Yeah. And
And groundwater is a big part of that.
Yeah, and it's a good
Yeah.
example of how, policy can help lead that way. It takes a while, it's challenging to do, but I think it's an important concept is the science is needed, the experimentation, the innovation is needed at various levels, and then you gotta play the game in Sacramento. We've all learned that and shape this policy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but that helps create some of these roads. So I think optimism-wise, one thing that excites me working with you all, and there's a good number of you folks out there in the water world, that it's gonna look a lot different, I think, in the next 20, 30, 40 years. We are gonna do this thing differently. We did a lot infrastructure-wise 30, 50 years ago that have hamstrung us, and we're learning from that. And we're starting to make some of these bigger infrastructure changes that are gonna set the stage for the next 20 to 30 years. And I feel like it's a bit of an inflection point here over the next decade on California water. So it's a pleasure to have you all help and lead the way on that. So let's thank you, and let's open it up to you all. So what do you got? Any questions for these folks? Linda?
I have a few questions, but I'll start with one. Since you were talking about ecosystem management, you're talking about farms, fish, water, people, birds. Is Nags Ranch the classic example now of how to work with that, and should that really double, triple in size and as a role model? And you guys can explain what that is to those who don't know about.
Bruce, you want to give the Nags Ranch summary?
Yeah, so I think Linda's talking about Nags Ranch was in the Yolo Bypass, which has been a great experiment plot that started maybe 7, 8 years ago by Jacob Katz, who was a PhD doctoral student, I think, at the time. Maybe you were in that realm with him? At UC Davis, yeah. And what started is with Jacob working on a 5-acre experiment of throwing these fish out into a mud puddle in a fallow rice field, and showing that they grew. I think everybody's seen the pictures of how fast they grew. It really showed some promise. So, great example of a small experimentation that started out at 5 acres has now grown to tens of thousands of acres where this is happening throughout the valley. And then obviously the tie-in with managing that for the waterfowl too, it really feeds into one of the classic examples of how we can use these lands for multiple benefits, recharging groundwater and fish and birds.
Yes, I think it should be expanded. I also think that we need to do traditional flows in rivers. We need to put more things for fish to hide in rivers. So we need all of the above. But Nags Ranch is a great example of that holistic care, right? So it's thinking about the ecosystem as a whole rather than trying to manage for a specific species. There's some really interesting work going on now to model where it makes the most sense to do that. How can we get water in the right places at the right times, behind the levees in some cases, or in the flood bypasses? What infrastructure changes do we need to do to be able to manage that water? And the other exciting thing is to think about how do we use forecasting and technology to know when we need to put that water out there for fish and birds, and when there are years where we don't need to pay landowners to do that. So I think that's some of the cutting edge stuff that CalTrout and others are working at.
Thank you.
It's really cool.
Thank you.
And I would just add on to that, I think that I do think that Nag Ranch model should and can be scaled up. But I think there's also that work and other work in a few other places has really kind of shifted the paradigm in the way that we think about restoring salmon populations, and that's focusing on restoring the productivity of these ecosystems, which is exactly what the Nags Ranch is doing. It's getting water on the floodplain that's driving the base of the aquatic food web that's feeding these fish. So we've been using these terms foodscapes. Like, can we restore these foodscapes for fish? And these floodplains are the key most productive habitats in the landscape, but there are other parts of the landscape where we can also restore that productivity. And thinking about the way that fish move through these watersheds in space and time, and ensuring that they have the food resources that they need to grow and be healthy. And I think this sort of concept holds merit in coastal watersheds too, not just in places like the Central Valley. And so I think there really is a lot of new thinking, a lot of exciting science around this, where we're thinking, beyond just, water, flowing down a channel, but really what again, kind of getting back to functions, like what is this water doing? How is this water interacting with the landscape in a way that provides food for these organisms?
Amazing how food has been so overlooked for so long. Corey.
Yeah, so I feel like there's an elephant in the room that hasn't been looked at, and that's the Trump administration.
We were dancing around.
I know, we touched on it for a minute, but one of the things I really admire about CalTrout, and we've talked about that, Curtis, is the science first approach.
Yeah.
But we have a federal government that doesn't believe in science.
Yeah.
We have a federal government that denies climate change. We have a federal government who thinks that the environment is there so that people who are wealthy can use it to get wealthier, with no thought of consequences for the future. And I recognize that most of us, I hope most of us in the room are hoping that that's time limited in a very short term now, but that's not guaranteed in any way, because there is a large section of the population of this country for whom environmental issues are not on the radar screen.
Yeah.
They'll vote for whoever opposes abortion, and it doesn't matter what else they think about anything, for example.
Yeah.
So could we talk about how that's having an effect on policy? I know we keep talking about going to the state, but we can't go just to the state, because you're saying the federal government has a water project in the black hole. They're not going to give that up because they want to use it to make money.
Yeah.
So I want to chime in early, and then everybody can do this. We are not powerless here in California, and sometimes we feel powerless. And
We'd be more powerful if we secede.
We have a system of laws here in California that we can use as leverage in all of this. And of course, besides waiting by the river long enough, and this is the way the federal. Let me give you a quick example. In the Clean Water Act, which is run by the federal government, the very thing that certain members of the Trump administration are trying to loosen up, and it turns out we administer the Clean Water Act in California. The State Water Resources Control Board has the power to administer it. They're the ones who set water quality control plans. So there is a tremendous amount of power there. Now, the EPA traditionally steps in when you have not protected the resource enough. We're about to experience, I think you guys will agree with me, the strangest of all circumstances where the federal government wants to lower standards below what a state is setting, and that probably won't survive in court in the long run. So we are actually setting those water quality standards. We have our own Endangered Species Act, and in fact we have the power, if we want, within that Endangered Species Act to protect the federal species as well under the California Endangered Species Act. So I remind you, we are not without power. And then there are some flukes in federal law. There are things like the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which was done in the 90s, which allocated a block of water to the environment. Badly managed, but it's a block of water for the environment. And it also stated that the federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation, must adhere to state laws, and particularly water rights. So we have a water rights program. So believe it or not, I'm much more optimistic, I know that's a rare thing to hear from me, about this, our ability to basically live with a period of threats from the federal government than you might read in the newspaper.
Very interesting.
Does anybody else want to talk about that?
I wonder if you talk about the Army Corps issues and rule curves, and it's kind of an interesting facet. It's not really politics, but
Well, let's tag team on it.
yeah.
You were touching on that.
We were, and it's because my view is, oftentimes you look at 30-year horizon, when the state's flush with cash, the feds normally aren't. And when the feds are doing quite well, the state seems to be secondary. It just happens.
Yeah.
I kind of think that we're looking at needing to be fluent in both the federal capital and the state capital is what I just am espousing that. So in our case, we recognized that the Army Corps of Engineers, when they're doing something good, you can actually acknowledge it. And so with the Lake Mendocino project, and again, one of the big attributes is going to be we're trying to hold water back for the late fall when we need to release water in the late summer for fish. And so that's part of the motivation here. The science is showing us, and the Corps has actually worked with us to modify our rule curve, which is what guides our management of Lake Mendocino. They did that because they took such heat for releasing about half the water supply that we had in the reservoir. And when atmospheric river hit our reservoir in 2012, the rule curve said you must release that, no ifs, ands, or buts.
Right in the beginning of the drought.
Right in the drought, and the drought happened right after that. half the water supply gone. We had to do a better job, so we went to work and created a team that included the Bureau of Reclamation, USGS, and the Corps in problem solving and how to do a better job. And it's one of the few breakthroughs I can point to say, when you get the federal government, you got to take it where you can. I share your concern that right now we're getting hammered, and it's not helping. And there's too few cases which you can point to a state and federal cooperation, but we do have one. We're going to play that out. We're going to modify our rule curve, and I think if we can do it in Mendocino, again, we're smaller. You want to replicate that. So the next one is Prado Dam in Orange County. They're following the same model. And believe it or not, Turlock Irrigation District is realizing, boy, we could do a better job too using that advanced science. So share what you know, work with bright folks, scientists, and we can do a better job.
And to be able to do it with the Army Corps, which tends to be one of the more difficult federal agencies to do. So that is encouraging. George?
I'm curious, because it's never really been clear to me, how is the price of water decided in California? Who decides it and how does it?
Your expert is standing.
Ellen might need to step up for this one. Come on, Ellen. Pinch it.
There's no one price of water. There are a lot of prices of water, and I think, a big part of the difference, if you look at sort of in agricultural areas, the irrigation water will cost less than urban water per gallon or, per unit. Some of that difference is just because urban water is treated for drinking water standards, and it's got to be moved through a lot of underground pipes to get to homes, whereas irrigation water just isn't treated, just goes down ditches. So that's part of the difference. Another big part of the difference is whether you depend on gravity or whether you depend on energy to get your water to you. So like Drink Up out here, welcome to Hetch Hetchy water that we've got here, that's all gravity fed. We're taking it from Yosemite, and I'll get to that piece of it in a moment, but we don't have to pay energy, whereas when you get water down in LA, it's got to get pumped over the mountains before it gets to LA. So a lot of the differences that you see are just about the geography and the complexity of the system, but in general, what we don't pay for is that surcharge that Grant was mentioning, which is some extra money to help provide some environmental benefits. We get the water itself for free, and what we pay for is just the plumbing and the treatment.
So one small follow-up question to that is that given that 70% of California's water usage is agricultural, and most of our water infrastructure, the dams are hyper expensive, right? While they use canals, the dams are pretty expensive. Is water undervalued currently?
I would say, in the sense, there are two ways in which the value of water could be improved, in the sense of improving incentives for people. One is by everybody paying, I don't know, is it $65 an acre foot now?
At 85, I ratchet up as much as I can.
Some surcharge to help on top of whatever the other costs are, to help with kind of the public benefits of our water, of our ecosystems. And then the other thing is allowing more trading of water, because right now some of the big differences in prices are because you got your water a long time ago, it's a very senior water right, it's an old system, you don't have to pay a lot. If you're new in the system, as you're a growing community or a new area for irrigation, you're later in the chain and you're paying more. You're also the first to lose the water in a drought. Just like the ecosystem often during a drought will lose water. If we have good trading arrangements where willing buyers and willing sellers can exchange the water, that improves the incentives because it kind of gets more toward an equalized price. And trading has been super helpful for birds, for example, and I think it has potential to be helpful for fish too, in addition to helpful for cities and farms.
I think it does if we can get the environment to play on equal footing with those who are better versed in water markets and water trading. Because you cited earlier the Central Valley Project Improvement Act that was passed in 1992 and gave a block of environmental water to our public refuges. They have not once received their full water supply. Not one time in 25 years. So we're not on even footing right now. So if we were
it
to...
look good on paper.
So it looks great on paper, but we're arguing over a drop in the bucket to try to get to these last remaining wetlands, and we haven't been able to do it.
This is why Ted's idea, which is part of something we've all been working on, you allocate a block of water to the environment and you treat it like a water right. And you let them manage it. You
A senior water right.
A senior water right. The more senior, the better. Don't forget this 1707 stuff. But we're senior water right. I think this would go a very long way because it allows you to do the trading, it allows you to do storage, it allows you to flexibly allocate it, and I think that's the only way we can really successfully adapt and Meghan gets some of that water too.
And fish.
Not just fish.
Spreck and then Bill? Okay.
I wanted to ask about aquifer recharge in the San Joaquin Valley and Tulare Basin is the shortest place where all the aquifers are critically overdrafted, and in the last 3 years, there have been substantial excess flows, I think, beyond what wildlife would need that have flowed out of the basin and not been captured. Those regions also have the biggest, unless I'm mistaken, recharge projects, being the Frank Kern Canal and Kern Water Bank, and both those have been heavily criticized for environmental reasons, and rightly so. But where, on which rivers and in which locations, and which farmers, where are we gonna recharge the aquifers? In 5 years, if we can get people to cooperate, we have another year like 2017 or 2019. Is it on the Merced? Is it on the Tuolumne? Is it on the Tule River? Where are these places?
So we're going to probably tag team all of this.
We're all like,
So Ellen is the lead author on a look at this last year, and I think the takeaways, put in the simplest thing, Houston, we have a conveyance problem, and that is the ability to move water from the places where we have it to the places where we can recharge it. So let's like the Tulare Basin as your example, where your groundwater overdrafting is the most dramatic, and you also have the best places for recharging, but you also have the least amount of water. And by the time you get to the San Joaquin Valley, you actually have the most abundant water in that system because you have the San Joaquin and the Merced and the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus as the wet rivers in that, the wetter rivers in that system. But unfortunately, they're occurring in a place where your recharge potential isn't as good and your groundwater basins are in better shape. So it's being able to move it. So I think, Spreck, the thing, if I were going to tell the new governor something to do on this, I would have his resilience portfolio that he's doing look very, very closely at the way we move water around. As you all know, the Frank Kern Canal basically moves water into the Tulare Basin from the San Joaquin River, but because of groundwater pumping and land subsidence, it's lost most of its capacity. It's an absolute tragedy of the commons, that the very system which you would use to recharge groundwater has been degraded by groundwater withdrawals.
Well, and there was a ballot measure that would have funded that. Should the public pay for that, or should the farmers pay for it?
I don't know.
So that's where you get into the innovative thinking running into policy, right? So one of the worries about funding that improvement on that canal was that it was just a lead to a workaround to build temperance flats, right? So fund the canal, Frian has more money to build temperance. It's one of these things where people are trying to think 3 moves down the road, and what does one seemingly good project result down in the future? Whether that's reality or not, I don't know. What is reality is Frank Kern Canal is heavily subsided and doesn't have very much capacity. And the subsidence, unfortunately, is mostly due to groundwater pumping from people that are outside of their water district in what they call the white zones, which is not managed by a specific district. So it's a reality of an infrastructure challenge running into political game theory.
Let's not forget, we all eat too.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's the problem. You say it's the farmer's
Yeah.
problem, but wait a minute, the farmers are growing our food.
Yeah. Bill?
I got 2 questions. First of all, you talked about the fish below the reservoirs is not being properly managed. What's the solution to that? Is it oversight or, monitoring or?
I mean, it's both. I mean, I think based on some work that we did earlier and just like I'm taking a look across the state, there's a state law that requires that fish be maintained in good condition below dams, but very well, with the exception of the larger ones are largely monitoring both flows and fish populations. But monitoring is a big part of it that just doesn't exist, or if it is, or if these systems are monitored, those data are just buried in filing cabinets somewhere. And so really developing sort of standardized.
Self-monitored?
Well, generally speaking, the state's not doing anything, and we're losing. If you've seen, there's been a lot of press and a few papers on we're actually losing gauges, stream flow gauges that we use to track how much water is moving through our system, at a time when arguably it's more important than ever to know what's happening. And so there are, I think, individual water districts or irrigation districts will monitor, but those data often don't come to light. The state water board has passed some recent made some policy changes that do require improved reporting of diversions and so forth. That could be helpful. But the first step is monitoring, and then figuring out ways to manage these reservoirs a little differently. So this is bypassing water, particularly in the dry season, potentially allowing some storm flows to pass if the dams aren't already at capacity. We've seen this work in places like Poudre Creek and in the Trinity River, and even some systems on the North Coast. So I think it's difficult though, because a lot of these individual dams, they're privately owned or locally owned, and they don't fall under the same. They're just not on the same oversight that we see.
And
for
one of the
projects.
things that Ted's research really pointed out with this Fishing Game Code 5937, that simply says any dam owner needs to have enough water going below that dam to keep fish in good condition. That's almost literally what it says. And remember too that was CalTrout Audubon, Mona Lake, back in the 80s. It was a 1-2 punch with Audubon bringing a public trust lawsuit, and CalTrout coming behind that with this Fishing Game Code 5937 lawsuit against LADWP to maintain the public trust, which was Mona Lake, and keeping the water level at a certain amount. And then Fishing Game Code 5937 coming in and saying those tributaries to Mona Lake, which LADWP was diverting out of, and basically running dry, you need to comply with 5937. So it really pitted that Fishing Game Code against a state water right, a big one, LADWP, and we won. And I think the energy behind that law back then was great, and it's we would like to use it more. And I think what Ted's research really showed is that there are these places with some of these dams out there where the combination of water to give and lack of compliance or lack of any rule, that this code could really help. So I think to answer your question, that's one avenue that we would like to pursue more.
Real quick. So from what I've read, and a lot of people are shocked by this, but I've read this in numerous publications, the GDP of agriculture is about 3 to 8% in our state. That's what I've read numerous times.
It's less than that.
Okay, so it's less than 3. So what gives? 70%, 70, 80% of the water, I don't get it. I know it's political.
This is all you.
Well, it's all political, but I don't get it.
So I used to, I guess I'm on video sort of saying that. Yeah, it's too.
You're on video again.
It's too
Actually, so just mind your words.
But let me flip that around. It takes water to grow food, and I mean that's not flippant. I mean, it takes water to grow food. It takes an average of 3 feet of water on the land to grow a reasonable crop. I mean, I'm giving you examples.
One of my best friends is an almond farmer, so I know where you're coming from.
Okay, so so water is a necessary throughput for agriculture, and you can argue all you want about efficiency. The work we've done at PPIC shows that they're actually being surprisingly efficient with the use of their water. And that is, we're growing far more valuable crops than we used to with the same amount of water, even a little bit less. So the farm GDP, not as a percentage of the state, but farm GDP in general has been growing quite substantially. So farmers are becoming much more efficient. And be careful what you ask for. Sometimes the application of efficiency, and Meghan is very well aware of this. We use inefficiency in farms to recharge groundwater. I mean that's the primary
And
source
create
of
bird
groundwater.
habitat.
And we really need it for bird habitat.
Yep.
And all of that. So I have over the years and working with folks and economists sort of come to a more nuanced view of this. That is, water is a necessary throughput. One of the things I heard during the drought is, this is like saying, God damn it, Silicon Valley is using 98% of the programmers in California. That's an outrage. But right, they need programmers as a throughput for their industry. And if we're going to be an agricultural powerhouse, that's where the water goes. I mean, it goes principally to agriculture, and we are the most productive, not just state in the union, we're one of the most productive in the world when it comes to agriculture. So now, having said that, I do think we need to focus very carefully on balancing our uses of water and rebalancing the uses of the water and trying to come up with innovative ways to do it without simply going out to the farms and saying, we're going to take your water away.
And I'd like to add to that just really quickly. We've built our farm economy and our water infrastructure in California in 200 years. Like, it's a second in the time scale of humanity. I was just in Greece and was going to some ruins, and I was thinking about how much we've changed this landscape in such a short time here in California in comparison to how long that civilization has been around. So we're not done evolving here. We've just started changing the system and realizing what our changes have caused, and I suspect that the face of agriculture will look different. I think we will always have agriculture, to Jeff's point, because it's highly productive here. We have sunshine almost all year round. It's a desert in many parts, so it's very hot and dry. Your one thing you need water to be able to grow these. So we grow per acre a very high value and high efficiency crop. But to his point, the trade-offs are some of these low-value flood irrigated crops are what are propping up our Pacific flyway bird populations. So as we look at SGMA being enacted, and we look at farmers having to make choices, do I grow alfalfa or do I grow almonds? And I can't pay for my water if I grow alfalfa. They're going to switch to almonds, which are far less valuable for birds, no matter how much I love my almond milk. So
Yeah.
I think it's a really good question.
Dave Van
I
Court.
wish it was a black and white answer.
Yeah, I've lived in California my whole life, and it feels like through my lifetime, California rarely has a so-called average rainfall year. It's usually feast or famine. If feast or famine is going to become even more extreme with climate change than it has been, what do we do physically to take advantage of the feast years when we get more atmospheric rivers than average? In recent years, and we've seen atmospheric rivers where you're getting all of a sudden within a matter of 48 hours, 25, 30,000 CFS at Healdsburg, and then 2 days later, 50,000 at Guerneville, and 2 days later, it's gone.
Yeah. Well, Grant, you deal with this all the time.
Yeah, locally, and that's exactly our challenge. We have to, these are coming in intense, short periods of time. You've got to create the mechanisms, probably off floodplain managed areas that can recharge the aquifers while that water is available. Because I've been there multiple times watching that water go by thinking we have not done an adequate job. Floodmar, you heard earlier, in our case, we're taking water out of our pipelines, which are taking that water and bringing it down to the very southern end of our district down in Sonoma, the city of Sonoma, parking it into a city well that's underutilized right now, putting it into the ground to be able to take it out later when it's needed, in the summertime when it's getting dry, with the cooperation of a sustainable groundwater management agency. So these things are starting to emerge, but clearly that sort of take advantage while you've got that volume of water, do a better job of getting that into the ground, because this can kind of be your bank. And that area is, we need experts out there, by the way. You need scientists that can do this, water managers. It's not an easy task. There's also water rights that are involved. So we've got some heavy-duty policy work we got to do as well to make that possible.
And is new surface storage something that should be considered? I know dams are considered to be verboten, but on the other hand, it's the only way to get a handle and hold on to water if you don't already have the capacity to immediately pump it underground, because you don't have any time to deal with it when you have an atmosphere.
So we have a number of, again, there are no black and whites in, the only black and white.
Only blues.
Yeah, the only black and white is there are no black and whites in California water. So we are proposing construction of a number of dams. There's the Sites Reservoir on the Sacramento, which has got very muted environmental opposition. It's a shock in our lifetime to see such a thing, but it's an off-channel storage. It's actually quite large. I forget how many acre feet would be in it. And it probably will go forward if they get the financing. There's the Los Vaqueros. There's I don't think Temperance Flat will ever be built. It just doesn't seem to pencil out in terms of cost. So we are going to be building surface storage, but I just want to be clear, all the good sites are gone. I mean, we've already built all those. Thanks to Ronald Reagan, we've locked up the North Coast in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Everybody seems to forget that he signed off on that.
And some bad sites have been built.
Yeah, well, he did that too.
Clear about that.
Yeah, well, again, we're going to thank Richard Nixon for the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. So we will always be looking at additional surface storage. What I see in the future of surface storage, by the way, is small projects, probably little projects scattered, sort of like a distributed energy grid. I mean, a more distributed. That'll probably be the next phase. But right now, we're not talking about really big, honking storage. And here's the simple reason: if you can't fill it, it doesn't do you any good. And so this is going to the problem with Temperance Flat on the San Joaquin. They're probably not going to fill it very often. And what that means is it's a stranded asset. For year after year, you got to pay for that dam, and you got no water in it to pay for it. So a lot of these things just don't pencil out economically. And if it doesn't pencil out economically, and the federal government's not going to come in and suddenly be putting large amounts of money that Grant had talked about, we got feast and famine. We're pretty much in the famine on the federal side. I don't see a lot of big surface storage. So this is why, as Ted said, it's groundwater. We got enough capacity in groundwater. We got 100 million
It's
acre
groundwater
feet.
and conveyance, as you mentioned too.
We got 100 million acre feet worth of potential storage in groundwater. That's 2.5 times the total storage in all our surface.
So the last thing I would add that hasn't been brought up yet in terms of strategies for dealing with these extremes. So we've talked about getting water in the ground during wet years and maybe operating reservoirs a little differently, maybe moving water around through conveyance projects. Upland watershed restoration, I think, is sort of the fourth strategy. Dealing with the health of our headwater forests and finding ways to slow down the runoff from these systems, improve their resilience to fire so we don't deal with the catastrophic effects of major storms, and finding ways to really infiltrate water at the watershed scale. And there's a lot of interest in that too, and a lot of progressive water agencies that are investing in watershed restoration. Probably some of the money from your taxes are going towards that. So I think thinking at the watershed scale too, not just at the dam or the valley, but really looking up is going to be important.
So I know Corey, you had another question. I'm sure there's a few more out here, but we promised to be done at 8, and it's 8. So
we'll hang around.
So we'll hang around. There's more drinks out there. I think there's more food.
We'll definitely hang around.
Yeah, so we'll definitely hang around. But let's thank our panelists. Very nice and kind folks. Thanks for taking time out of your very busy schedules. And I think you obviously see there's a lot of work going on. I mean, for us, we overlap with all these people, which is really cool. Dozens of projects throughout the state. And just to remind you how a lot of, especially us nonprofit and academics work, the seed funding that you all provide, and how we leverage that with grant funding. But the seed funding that you provide provides us to pursue the opportunity, to develop the science, and then to leverage that. In our case, it's often 3-to-1 with private money to grant money. That's how important it is. So really, a lot of the work that's being done on the innovation side is really starts with you all in that private seed money. And don't forget, it's end of the year coming up. So as our organization grows, we hope you grow with us. So we appreciate you taking time out of your evening to be here. So thank you. Thank you for coming. Thanks PPIC for being here. I think Ellen had to step out, but enjoy some drinks and food, and we'll hang out a little longer. Nicely done. Nicely done. Good job.
Can we do a scoop shot real quick, please?
Oh, yeah.
I love the flattery. Keep it coming. It's good to see you.
I
How you been?
I wish I could remember that trip.
Oh, right. I was actually.
Between you not and my knee popping.
All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. Excellent.